Hi guys, this is Luis. Welcome back. So now our installation is done, and so I'm going to click close here. But when you notice, we have promote this server to a domain controller. So we can click this and then we can promote the server to a domain controller. But then I don't want to do this from here because I want to show you something. If you are familiar with the previous server editions, server 2003, 2008, after installing Active Directory domain services, the next thing you have to do is you have to run a command called dcpromo. But in server 2012, dcpromo has been incorporated into the server manager. So even if I open the command prompt and then I type dcpromo, and I hit enter, it says the Active Directory Domain Services installation wizard is relocated into the server manager. So dcpromo is not going to work. That's for those of us who are familiar with the previous server. So you notice that right after the installation, there is a notification here. So when I click on this, it says that promote this server to a domain controller. Configuration required for Active Directory domain services at DC1. So whenever you install any role and it requires additional configuration settings, there's going to be a notification here. Now, before we promote our server into a domain controller, there are some few things that we need to understand. We have to look at the Active Directory component. The Active Directory component. Now, in order to understand how Active Directory work, there are certain things that we need to also understand. And some of these terminologies I'm going to list here and then we are going to explain them. The first one is domain. Then we have tree. Then we have forest. Then we have site. Then we have domain controller. And then we have global catalog. Now let me start with the domain. Now domain is basically a way that we organize computers in Microsoft's environment. Are we okay? Now in this organization of computers, resources and directory database and everything about the network is stored on a centralized system. So we define domain as a logical grouping of computers in a network in which all information and resources about these computers are stored on a central system. That is the domain controller. Then we have the tree. Now, there may be situations where you have multiple domains. Most of the time you have a parent domain and a child domain. So let's take, for example, I have a domain called luis.com. Then I have another domain called support.luis.com. Now support.luis.com is a child to the parent luis.com. Therefore the tree is defined as a collection of domains that share a common namespace or a contiguous namespace. So I may also have sales.luis.com. Now, between all these, there is a common name there, which is the luis.com. Then we have the forest. Now, forest is different from domains and trees. Now, forests do not have contiguous namespace. Are we okay? But what devices or computers in the forest have in common is what we call a global catalog server. So you can have two different domains. I have luis.com and then I have yahoo.com. Now these are two different domains, but then we will share a common database which is a global catalog server, so that users in luis.com can access resources in yahoo.com. So the forest is a collection of domain trees that do not share a common namespace, but rather they share a common global catalog server. Then we have the site. Sites are used to represent or denote the physical location of a particular domain. Then we have the domain controller, which is any server that has Active Directory installed on it. Then the global catalog server, it's also a domain controller, but this domain controller receives a replica or a copy of all the records on every other domain controller in the domain. So this is more like the mother domain controller. So if you have multiple domain controllers in the domain or forest, all of them are going to send a copy of their database, as in the records they keep, to this particular server. And most of the time, the very first server you install in your environment, the very first server you make a domain controller, automatically becomes a global catalog server. So now that we have understood this, I think we can go ahead and make this server a domain controller. So I'm going to click on the notification bar, then promote this server to a domain controller. So this is going to bring up another wizard. So if you're also familiar with the previous server, you notice that there's been some changes here. So we have the deployment operation. Now the first option says add a domain controller to an existing domain. The second option says add a new domain to an existing forest. And then the last option says add a new forest. Now this is a new installation we have done. We don't have any other domain anywhere. So the very first domain we are going to create is going to be our forest. So we select add a new forest. Add a new forest. Now we need to specify a domain name. We need to specify a domain name. Now I'm going to name my server or my domain louis.com. louis.com. So this is my root server. You can call yours whatever you want to call yours. Then I'm going to click next. Then we have what we call the forest functional level and the domain functional level. Now this is what the functional level does. It's just asking you, do you already have an existing domain controller in your organization that is running a previous version of the server that you would want this new server that you are installing to be able to communicate with? So if in your entire forest you have some servers that are 2008, some that are 2003, then you might want to bring down your forest functional level. But then if you do not have any server running the previous server version, but rather this is your first server, and any other server you are going to be installing in the future are going to be running server 2012 R2, then you leave the forest functional level on Windows Server 2012 R2. But then if they exist in the domain previous server editions, then you have to lower the forest functional level. Then we have to specify the domain controller capabilities. So you notice that we have domain name services. So the Active Directory requires DNS. And so to be able to function better, we are required to install DNS. So we are going to enable it and then we will install DNS. Then you notice there's another option, Global Catalog, and it is grayed out. Because this is the very first server we are installing, automatically it is going to be the parent server, the root forest, and therefore it's going to be a global catalog server, meaning that any other domain controller we install is going to send a copy of their database to this server. Then we have read-only domain controller. Now read-only domain controller simply means that this server will only replicate or obtain its data from another server. No one can sit behind this server and then enter anything or alter anything in the database. Now this is mostly used in environments where you cannot be physically present to secure the server. So since this is our very first server, it's going to be a writable server, therefore it cannot be a read-only domain controller. We also need to specify a directory restore mode password, so that in the events where we want to restore our Active Directory, or even when we want to remove Active Directory, we will need to provide a password. Now this should not be the same as the administrator password for security reasons, because if someone is able to guess your administrator password, the person will also assume that your directory restore mode password is also the same thing. So I'm going to specify a password. And then we can click next. So from here we click next. Then it's going to verify the NetBIOS name that has been assigned to the domain, which will be Luis, the single name for our domain, which will be Luis. Then we can click next. Then we have the data, the paths where the various files are going to be stored. So our Active Directory database is going to be stored on drive C, Windows, in a folder called NTDS. But for security reasons, it is not advisable that you store your Active Directory database on your drive C, because when your Windows crashes, then there is trouble, especially if you don't keep proper backups. So it is advisable that you always specify an alternate path. We've not yet created other virtual hard drives, so we don't have any drive, so we are going to leave it where it is. Then the Active Directory log files are also going to be stored in the same location. Then we have the system volume, or the sysvol. The sysvol is a shared folder that the servers use to exchange information. So whenever the servers want to communicate amongst themselves or replicate information or data, the data is placed in the system volume, and that is how they are able to replicate information amongst themselves. So that has also been created. But again, in a production environment, you don't store these data in the drive C. So we click next. So it gives us a summary of everything that we have selected, and we can actually click view script. So if we were supposed to be doing this in the PowerShell, then these were the commandlets or commands we were supposed to have typed to achieve this aim. So I'm going to close this, and then we can click next. So it's going to do a prerequisite check. Now this is also something new, because previously your installation will start, and then if there is an error, it will tell you that the installation failed. But this time around, it's going to do a prerequisite check to see whether the system meets the requirement to become a domain controller. Now, as you can see, it says all prerequisite checks passed successfully. Click install to begin. So we're just giving some cautions. So we can click install. So basically, this is how you make a server a domain controller. Once the installation is done, it's going to ask for a restart. So I'm going to pause the recording, and when the installation is done, we will continue from there.